Can I wish you a warm welcome to the University of Aberdeen for this, which is the 8th event in the series being run by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, looking at some of the key questions around the forthcoming referendum. What we're calling this is the Enlightening Debate series. We hope to enlighten some of these issues, and we've already done several, as I'll mention in a moment. But I would like to begin by saying that I'm very pleased that we are here first of Edinburgh, here in Aberdeen. Sir Ian Diamond, the principal of Aberdeen, was very kindly involved in inviting us to this and laying on these fantastic facilities. So thank you very much indeed, Ian, for doing that. So before I say more, can I just quickly tell you what debates we have so far had. The first one was on Scotland and the European Union. The next one was on tax and spending. The third one was on defence and international relations. And then we did the real economy. And then currency, banking and financial services. And then culture and broadcasting, and then borders, immigration and citizenship. So these are the 8 events that we've so far had. The tradition is that each of these events is actually recorded and filmed, and the recording and the film goes on to the Royal Society of Edinburgh website virtually instantly. So they are accessible there, but they're also published. All of these papers have been released for publication and are available, I think, outside this room. And the same will happen with this particular symposium, this particular debate. And tonight's event is being videoed, as I said. Looking ahead at the forthcoming events after this, the next one is on welfare and public services, and that will be held in November at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And then we're having a Scottish debate on currency, banking and tax. And the reason for that is that the first of these debates on currency and banking was actually held in the British Academy in London. There are 3 of these events that have been held in London according to British Academy rules, which is different from ourselves. It's a much smaller meeting and it's not published. It's Chatham House rules. But the issues raised were so important that we have decided to repeat that debate here in Scotland. So tonight we are discussing matters concerning the possible impacts of constitutional change upon higher education and upon research, particularly science research. We'll examine the possible effects of independence on the ability and ease with which students on either side of a new border would be able to access education on either side of that border, and not a trivial question. And also, perhaps as important, how the funding of research will be conducted in the light of Scottish independence. Because at the moment, the Research Council's UK fund research across the universities across the whole of the UK, and Scotland, as I pointed out before publicly, do extremely well in that situation. With 8.5% of population, we attract more than 15% of research monies, and in medicine, more than 20% of research monies. So how is all that going to work in the light of Scottish independence, if that is the outcome of the referendum? The format is that each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes under the chairmanship, very able chairmanship of Mr. Ken MacDonald from the BBC, who is now world famous for interviewing our recent Nobel Prize winner, Peter Higgs, more times than anyone else. So well done, Ken. So Ken will keep order, and then we will have a completely open discussion. And the open discussion question and answer session is as important as the session on the presentations. So with these few remarks, I then hand over to Ken to run the meeting. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much for having me. Easily the least distinguished person who will be appearing before you this evening. I think one of the wonderful things about this is that it is a seminar, it is a discussion. That means we have 5 eminent speakers, and if you like, the 6th member of the team is you, and we'll be expecting and hoping that you have things you wish to contribute to this debate later on and questions you wish to raise. I'd like to ask up our first speaker now, who's Professor Rick Rylance, who's Chief Executive of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and as such possibly the only research council that hasn't yet claimed credit for Peter Higgs finding the boson. He's chair of the Research Council's UK executive as well, so actually he did help Peter Higgs find the boson. He's Honorary Professor of English at the University of Exeter. His research concerns literary and intellectual history and the history of psychology and understanding reading processes in the brain. So a bit of work to be done on me then. Professor Rick Rylance, welcome.
Thank you, Ken, and good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for inviting me along to speak. As John Arbuthnot just said, RCUK is as the name suggests, a UK-wide organisation, and we fund on the basis of excellence as the dominant criteria. So we don't pay any attention in terms of location, either geographic or political, though we do keep a weather eye open in terms of distribution of national capability and so on, and we try and from time to time stimulate that. Now within the system, again, as John said, Scotland does exceptionally well, and I think that's a key issue within this current debate, and it's a tribute, I think, to the quality of both Scottish higher education institutions and also Scottish research and researchers. But the key point is that if actually one shifted to a notional normative distribution of research funding by research councils, Scotland would lose, though that's a rather fantastic calculation because research power is very unevenly distributed anyway. But at the moment, this is a system by which Scotland actually gains some degree of advantage. Meanwhile, of course, it's only one part of what's called the dual support system for research. So alongside it, there is what is currently called the Research Excellence Framework. And in that, under a block grant system, money is distributed to individual researchers. And what happens in England, what happens in Wales, and what happens in Scotland is actually rather different. So there is local control over the distribution of income through that second part of the dual support system. What's crucial, I think, though, in this is that even though the actual income is distributed variably, there is consistency of system, method, and standards. And I do think that is actually quite an important point because it's something which is widely understood globally and is something which, for which the UK generally gains credit, and I'll come back to that. But what you've got then, when you put it alongside direct funding from government through, for example, the Ministry of Defence, you put it alongside charities, organisations like the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, you've got a rather delicate, in the modern jargon, ecology of research funding with a degree of variety and a very considerable degree of flexibility, which is, on a system-wide basis, is able to respond pretty carefully, and the proof of the pudding always is in the eating, and the UK does exceptionally well. We're on the podium for whatever disciplinary area you want to name in terms of world leadership, including Higgs boson and all the rest of it. The UK as a whole, as this litany is very familiar, we've got 1% of the world's population, we've got 3% of global research funding, 7.9% of all papers, 11.8% of world citations, 14.4% of the world's most highly cited research. So we are, across the UK, a very major world power indeed. And what is equally striking about this is that this is done in a very productively efficient way. We get more for each pound spent across the UK in terms of research than any other country, including the US, or particularly actually including the US, which tends to throw a bit more money at it. Now, it's tempting though you can never prove it, it's tempting to see a correlation between this success and the current level of mechanisms. The flexibility, the variety across the entire spectrum, those things, it seems to me, are probably correlated to achievement in a way which sets a benchmark for how you think about things might change. What I'm going to do now is just run through a series of risks, a series of issues that if you do start to change the system, then here are a number of things which you will have to guard against. They are, let me be clear, not an argument one side or the other for independence. They're things which, whatever system persists after the vote next year, are things one is going to have to be mindful of. So the first one really is around this issue of common methods and common standards, which I do think is really very, very crucial, that there is no elaborate perturbation of this. And it's an issue which is not just about mechanics of how you grade this, that, or the other, or run it. It's also about peer review and the peer review system. That if you create a smaller system or a segregatable system, then the pool of peer reviewers is inevitably going to shrink unless you go to a more internationally based thing. The size of the pool, the breadth of expertise, the ability to refresh that pool over time and to distribute workload, those are things which are crucially important and one has always got to be mindful of. There is also the slightly different but still related issue of maintaining that powerful overall UK-wide reputation, which doesn't make distinction between where the excellence is located. And all parts of the UK, as currently constituted, derive mutual advantage from that reputation. We all get a boost from the fact that the UK is generally rather good. There is supplementary advantage in that. A second issue that one might want to think about is hard to quantify, but it is the benefit to be gained from a relatively sizable system and with very strong internal competition, which is driving up quality as successive RAEs have demonstrated in one register. And this too might be something which might be thought to be in jeopardy with a smaller system running on a smaller scale with a degree of added international vulnerability. The third issue I'd like to put before you is in terms of trends which are happening not just within the UK but also worldwide towards greater concentration of resource and the development of outstanding and very distinctive centres of excellence. And the peer-to-peer collaborations this enables across the planet are things which one has to, again, to be mindful for. Increasingly, though not exclusively, it's a big player world in terms of research, for good or ill. Now, following on from that, there is, alongside it, an increasingly observable tendency towards collaboration and the pooling of research resources and research facilities. Now, Scotland is actually rather good at this and has pioneered a number of initiatives in facility sharing and cross-Scotland collaborations in doctoral training and other initiatives. But collaboration is also cross-border. And to take an example of the 1,100 current grants within the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, 400 are held in collaboration with institutions in England, Wales or Northern Ireland, or in some cases all three of those. And a number of the initiatives my own council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, has launched have Scottish presence. The Centre for Copyright, for example, is based in Glasgow with 7 partners across the UK, only 3 of which are Scottish. Again, we have a Centre for the Creative Economy Hubs based in Dundee, but which is geared towards the needs of the Scottish economy in particular, but is part of a wider system which involves other ones south of the border. So there are issues also in relation to this around the so-called national facilities. Those are those extremely expensive plants which is held predominantly in England, but not exclusively, where it would be impossibly expensive to try and duplicate this under multiple systems, but which currently all people have access to and which are crucial for the development of the quality of research we all desire. Alongside that, in terms of facilities, there are common facilities located abroad, Southern Hemisphere telescopes, for example, or the Rothera Research Station in the Antarctic. There are international subscriptions which are developed on a UK-wide basis, like CERN, which Peter Higgs enjoyed the benefit of. And these two, the subscriptions to these, which are always tightly fought in terms of money, not least because of variable currency fluctuations, these are negotiated on a UK-wide basis. And then you have the international networks of facilities across the world through the Science and Information Network in 33 countries, for example, or the RCUK offices in Beijing, Washington, Brussels, Delhi, and so on. Altogether, you've got a very considerable infrastructure here, which would need to be mindful of trying to operate in multiple systems if necessary. And then finally, I think in one sense, the most important point is around careers, research careers, and training, where currently people can flow across borders with relative ease, where people can develop a variety of and range of experiences encountering different sorts of intellectual environments, sharing and gaining access to different sorts of facilities. And I personally would worry a little if we started to chunk up the supply chain in terms of people's career developments and the spread of talent across the UK research base. It's something which gives us a lot of concern in England. You'll be aware, I'm sure, of the very familiar joke of the Scot who goes down to England and on return is asked, "Did you meet any Englishmen?" And the reply is, "No, I only met heads of departments." And that is the crucial problem we've got in terms of the way this talent is distributed. So, Ken, I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Well, it was a good way to get the ball rolling, I think. I'd like to... yes, well, thank you. It's very difficult, isn't it, to know how to behave at a seminar. If this was a debate, you'd all be applauding it. So that's good. We've established a principle here. Lindsay Patterson, I'll call him up next. He's from the University of Edinburgh School of Social and Political Science. He's Professor of Educational Policy. I've known Lindsay personally for a long series of lunches. He teaches courses in educational policy, research methods. His main academic interests are education, civic engagement, and political attitudes. It's worth bearing in mind that Lindsay is a demon sociological statistician. So if you ever find yourself having a difference of opinion with him, he will have the figures to back up his point of view. He has published widely on the expansion and purposes of higher education, social mobility, the relationship between education and civic values, on the 20th century history of Scottish education and in Scottish politics. I believe it is correct to say, and he will correct me if I'm wrong, that I think he has actually advised at one time or another every party in the Scottish Parliament, because he believes that knowledge is for all and not to be subject to political whim. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So for his thoughts, please welcome Lindsay Patterson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. In these opening comments, I'm going to ask 4 questions about Scottish universities in the context of the current debate about Scottish independence. First, how good is Scottish higher education? Secondly, how international is Scottish higher education? Third, how Scottish is Scottish higher education? And fourth, what political conditions are needed to enable Scottish higher education to flourish? So first then, the quality. Now, Scottish, as we have heard from Professor Rylands, Scotland's academic standing internationally is high, for example, with 4 or 5 universities in the top 200. Scotland competes successfully for research funding, as we've also heard, which is a more detailed check on quality. Scotland wins a share of UK Research Council income that is in line with its share of UK academics, just over 10%. The same is true, actually, if you look at it in more detail within broad academic fields. About 10% of UK academics that work in the various medical fields are in Scotland, and Scotland gets about 10% of Medical Research Council funding. 8% of social scientists are in Scotland, and Scotland gets about 8 to 10% of ESRC funding. Similar percentages apply to the AHRC, and another one, 10% of people working in environmental science are working in Scotland, and about 10% of the funding from the Natural Environment Research Council comes to Scotland. What's more, the income obtained by Scottish researchers in this competitive way has increasingly come through the route of open competition and less through the route of institutional grants. And this suggests that the share of resources earned here is driven by the autonomous activities of academics working in broadly the same way and to the same criteria as academics elsewhere in the UK. So on this first question, it seems to me, the key consideration for this debate is in maintaining Scottish academic quality, is maintaining Scottish access to the academic standards that are maintained by competition for research funds and keeping these funds at present levels. Now, maintaining access to international standards is a matter of international networking in the manner of the UK Research Councils and indeed also of the new European Research Council. Keeping access to adequate funding would require, if funded wholly within Scotland, at least £300 million extra funding per annum from the Scottish public spending pot every year, which would be equivalent to more than doubling the current grants in support of research from the Scottish Funding Council to the universities. Second question, how international are Scottish universities? The greatest fear of academics about Scottish autonomy has always been of parochialism, of being shut out from international networks. So the question here is whether Scottish universities are of high enough standing internationally to command respect on their own, separate from UK connections. There are two ways of looking at this: research achievement and appealing to international students. On most measures on research, Scotland performs extremely well by international standards and indeed also by UK standards, which, as Rylands has already said, are themselves high, although in common with all Western countries, Scotland's share of research is declining as China and India especially become more involved in science. Here are some telling examples. Scotland has a relatively high share of researchers relative to population, about 4.1 per thousand, above even the UK level, which is 2.9 per thousand. What's more, mostly these people in Scotland work in the public sector, and hence the writing of these researchers in Scotland is mostly freely available in the public domain. Second example, Scottish researchers produce more publications than average across the OECD, about 2.5 times as many as equivalent countries. Third example, Scottish researchers write papers that people notice. Scotland has a disproportionately large share of the world's most cited papers. And Scottish academics achieve this partly by working increasingly with people in countries outside the UK. Nearly half of Scottish publications by 2008 involved a co-author from outside the UK. Another version of this point about links with academics working in other countries is attracting academics from elsewhere to work in Scotland. The market for good academics is global. Around 1/2 of academic staff in Scotland are from outside Scotland, and about 1/2 of these, in other words, 1/4 of the total, are from outside the UK. In other words, even in the present constitutional situation, Scotland's universities are already on the world stage. Still on this question of international exposure, now students. If exposure to international networks is important for academics, there is analogously an intellectual benefit of international flows of students. In the past 40 years, there has been an enormous expansion in the movement of students globally, and a 5-fold increase since 1975. Globally, the flows are mainly from the rapidly developing countries to developed countries, but it's also important to remember that there is a great deal of movement around the European Union, which supplies 1/4 of all international students across the world. Scotland here has relatively high shares from international sources in its total student enrolment. 15% of first-degree students in Scotland are from outside the UK. That's less than the OECD leader, Australia, about 20%, and less also than the UK as a whole, which is about 18%. But the Scottish figure is twice the OECD average, 4 times the proportion in the USA, and higher than in countries with which Scotland is often compared, such as Sweden, Ireland, and Norway. Of course, if Scotland were independent, the category of international student would also include those from the rest of the UK, and thus would nearly double to about 28% if the present situation prevailed. This would be very high by international standards, for example, 8% more than the highest at the moment, Australia. So on both the international standing of Scottish research and also on the appeal of Scottish universities to students from outside the country, we can reasonably, I think, say at the moment that Scotland has a good international reputation. Now, the third question, how Scottish are the Scottish universities, which in a sense is the obverse of the thing that I've just asked. Though the cultural benefit of international student movement may be widely accepted, there is also, with such a high proportion from outside, potentially the controversy that it is too high. In other words, can a national system sustain, in a cultural sense, a level of incoming students as high as 28%? Now, the debate about the proportion of English students at Scottish universities has not been as strong in recent years as it was in the 1980s, but no doubt it could return. And indeed, there are precedents in the European Union of controversy arising when particular faculties have attracted very high proportions of students from outside a country's borders. For example, this happened in Belgium with students from France and in Austria in relation to Germany. And on the whole, although it's a bit obscure, certainly to a non-lawyer like me, the legal position seems to be that restrictions on flows between EU member states is not permissible. Nevertheless, though the proportions of external students in Scotland would be high by international standards, and nothing could be done about it even if we wanted to, what would not be unusual in an independent state would be the proportion from a neighbouring country, just under 1/2. That is, in fact, the norm. Most international students simply go across the border. 28% from outside is also not that different from the high points of incoming students at several points in Scotland's past. We forget, in fact, that the period of about the 60s to the 80s was a period of actually unusual parochialism in Scottish higher education. For example, levels at that level when students came for what was actually the very low fee regime at the time of the British Empire, or when non-religiously Anglican English students could attend Scottish but not English universities in the 18th century. Nor would Scottish universities face the linguistic pressures found in the universities of other small European nations, since Scotland's language of education is already English. And there is, it should be emphasised, no evidence of significant unmet student demand in Scotland. The rate of participation by students from Scotland has broadly followed the rising rate of qualification for entry to higher education, and it certainly didn't fall in the period since the rise of the rate of entry from outside Scotland or outside the UK. So on this third question, it seems likely that universities in an independent Scotland would have, by international standards, very high proportions from outside the country, but this level would not be without precedent in Scotland or wholly without parallel in other countries. Still, though not yet finished this third question, on the question of the Scottishness of the Scottish universities, half of Scottish academics, as I said, are from outside Scotland. And it has, of course, in the politically controversial debates that often surround this matter, been alleged in the past, and sometimes occasionally still today, that this level of incoming academics undermines Scottish university traditions. But in fact, away from the political rhetoric, whenever we have looked to gather evidence on this matter, survey evidence, for example, of academics, we find that academic activities, values, and achievements are similar regardless of origin. For example, incoming academics seem to share, or come to share, a Scottish predilection for seeing universities as public institutions that ought to serve the community, as well as serving international academic networks. And of course, this capacity to combine academic mobility is familiar elsewhere. I don't think the allegiance to that in Scotland is a kind of romantic attachment to the idea of the democratic intellect, so much as rather because such dual allegiance, both to the international networks and to the local community, is the norm in the highest status university system in the world, namely the United States. So now my fourth and final question: what political conditions are needed to enable Scottish higher education to flourish? Perhaps the most important political consideration for universities in a liberal society is that politicians are generous enough to fund them as a public good and respectful enough of their freedom not to interfere closely in how the money is spent. So it might be suggested that the overriding consideration for whatever state structures Scotland will have is that Scottish universities ought to have the academic autonomy which enables them to select the best staff and the best students with no regard to anything other than appropriate criteria of academic quality and potential. And by European standards, UK universities, including Scottish universities, have high levels of autonomy, in fact, extremely high levels of autonomy, as measured by such indicators as the capacity to make their own appointments, to set salaries, to promote staff, to select students, to design curricula, and to decide on how quality is to be measured. The evidence which I have briefly summarised here suggests that this autonomy and then letting academics follow their instincts informed by their expertise then does the rest in maintaining quality. So in conclusion, Since Scotland is already essentially autonomous in most aspects of higher education policy, it's unlikely, in fact, that independence would make much difference to that policy as such, as distinct, for example, from impinging upon it indirectly through social policy, economic policy, or fiscal policy. And that would include the question of student finance, which is really a matter of fiscal policy or social policy, not education policy, and in any case is in effect already completely devolved, as we see from the current variation in the position on student fees around the UK. The generally strong achievements of Scottish higher education and its already strong autonomy in policy and in institutional discretion can, of course, be interpreted in this current debate in two ways. It is both an argument in favour of independence. It shows, it could be claimed, what Scottish institutions can achieve when left to their own devices to engage autonomously with the rest of the world. But it's also an argument against independence, in the sense that things are broadly fine as they are, since Scottish universities are, generally speaking, flourishing and internationally distinguished. If Scotland were independent, Scottish higher education would have to continue to argue for its funding to be maintained, but that is in principle no different from at present. Scottish higher education would also have to insist that the principles of academic freedom continue to be respected. But there's really no sign, thankfully, of wanting to interfere with that academic autonomy from either side in the present debate about the future of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks very much, Lindsay. I would like to call up Stephen Salter now, Professor Stephen Salter, who's Emeritus Professor of Engineering Design at the School of Engineering at the University of Edinburgh. He says he likes very short introductions, so sorry, Stephen. After an apprenticeship in the aircraft industry and a degree at Cambridge, he's worked on robots, energy from waves and tidal streams, desalination, traffic congestion, computer-controlled hydraulic pumps and motors, flood prevention, mine clearance, the suppression of explosions, increasing the capacity of road bridges, and he's now, it's fascinating work actually, he's now working on the design of seagoing hardware reversal of global warming by making clouds whiter. Reports of his retirement, it says, are exaggerated, and here's proof. Professor Stephen Salter, please join us.
I read something in The Independent yesterday which I think is deeply symbolic. It's about the per capita spending on the NHS. And one of the bits of England that comes out with the best health is southeast Hampshire. And one of the things that they measure is the age at which people's health begins to decline. And in southeast Hampshire, it's 68 years. So ladies in southeast Hampshire have a lovely, happy life until they get 68 and then starts going down. But in Sunderland, it's 10 years less than that. It's only 58. And the new plan for the way NHS funding is allocated is going to increase the Hampshire allocation by 14% and reduce the Sunderland allocation by 11%. And to me, that really hurts. I feel ashamed about that, and it's showing that the level of compassion in the NHS in England is somewhere wrong. And I want to be governed by people who have more compassion than that, and I want them to exercise it efficiently. I think we have been getting increasingly psychopathic in the way Goldman Sachs, people like that, are operating. And I think this is something to do with big organizations, big countries. They attract the psychopaths. The psychopaths get promoted within the company, and the companies then become psychopathic. And I would hope that if we had an independent Scotland, that people would be attracted out of it. They'd go away somewhere else where they could be bigger, in a bigger pool. Well, so we're supposed to be talking about higher education and science, which are enormous fields, very wide indeed. And I think if you had seen Alex Salmond say that the rocks would melt in the sun before students had to pay in Scotland, you would have felt that higher education here was going to be okay. And I don't know much about the general field of science, but I can admire the sort of stuff that's going on in medicine in Dundee. As an engineer, I don't know the first thing about it. I just think it's great and I'm not worried at all about what will happen in future. Most of my collaboration at the moment is actually outside the UK. I've had quite a lot of money from Brussels, and I'm now working with people in Norway and America and Australia and all around. And the internet has made communications be very, very much more efficient. So don't worry about borders and academic research. It's all now in one big melting pot. Most of my early work was on wave energy. And when the first UK wave program began, we were a bit surprised that it was all being controlled by the nuclear people at Harwell. And to begin with, the devices were pretty bad. The cost estimates were very, very high, and the support from them never wavered a bit. But by 1981, the costs had come down to about 5 pence a kilowatt hour, with the program manager reckoning that they could be got down to about 3, which is getting uncomfortably close to the true costs of nuclear at the time. And suddenly the brakes went on, and the money was late in coming. Little reasons were given for delaying payments. It was really a miserable time, but I'm going to give you an example of how the data was nudged just to make things impossible. An important number is the failure rate of marine cables bringing energy back from a wave power device. And we were told at the beginning that you could measure the failure rate in kilometre years per fault. And the number they gave was 330 kilometre years per fault. And we worked out this. We were losing quite a bit, but we could just about live with that. In fact, in Norway, the number was 660 kilometre years per fault, and improving all the time. Norway has lots of undersea cables. But then they changed it. And in the end, they changed it down to 10 kilometre years per fault. And this meant that whatever you did out at sea, there'd always be a broken wire. None would ever come back to land. Now, in 1982, somebody laid a cable across the Pentland Firth to Orkney, and that's 43 kilometres long. And if you work out how many kilometre years it's done so far, it comes out to over 1,300. So it should have failed 130 times if it was a wave power device. But it hasn't failed once. So you have an example of some data that's measurable and known and adjusted downwards to make the nuclear energy more competitive than wave energy. So I actually talked to the Commons Energy Select Committee, and one of the members of that was a chap called Alex Salmond, and he was very encouraging. The committee wrote a nice report, and so they got shut down. They closed. I'll give you another example. The Pentland Firth is a very nice place to do tidal stream energy. And I believe that we are doing it in the wrong way because we're just copying wind turbines. And I believe that really the Pentland Firth is a duct, and you should use a different equation if turbines are in a duct rather than an open flow field. A chap called David Mackay, who's the chief scientist at DEC, agrees with me on this. But when you're going to do a grant application, it's a good idea to talk to the EPSRC to say, is this the kind of thing that you'd be interested in? And we did this, and they said, no, it's too regional. Okay? From the south, the Pentland Firth is an awfully long way away, and the cables are terribly long, and it's not interesting. The thing I'm working on at the moment is climate change. It's probably one of the most important worries we're going to have in really quite a short time. And the EPSRC, who you heard about earlier, now have a rule that if you apply for a grant and it's rejected, you can't reapply. I unfortunately applied to them before this rule came in, and I asked if this was retrospective, and they said yes, it is retrospective. Because I applied in 2006, I cannot reapply for this work. So the EPSRC are punishing people who are ahead of the game, if they're thinking a bit further ahead. I'm actually now, this is a bit boastful, but I'm a multi-millionaire because of one of the things we invented for wave energy was a new kind of digital control for hydraulic pump. And we couldn't get anybody in the UK or indeed in Europe to take this up, but a Japanese company has taken it up. And we found out the early days of this came from a grant to EPSRC. I put an application for this new way of controlling pumps. And they had just had a new head. And he wanted to see what grant applications were like. He said, send me a couple of applications, at the top of the list and the bottom of the list. And one of the ones they picked was my application. And he said, this is exactly the kind of thing we must be doing, really great. And the EPSRC people said, actually, it's the wrong way around. But because he was so keen, we got it. And Mitsubishi are now developing this thing, and we're going to be using it in wind turbines all over. So my enthusiasm for the wonderful grant-giving bodies is not very high at the moment. I should tell you also that people in universities are not all that happy at the moment. In fact, I got a thing yesterday saying there's going to be a strike. And then the final thing that worries me is that hardly any of the people who apply for university jobs now are from the UK. We get very good applicants from China and India and Eastern Europe, but nobody from the UK wants to work in a British university anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. Thought there. Thanks very much, Stephen. I'm wanting to call on Chris Hawksworth now. Professor Chris Hawksworth, I should say, is Deputy Principal and Deputy Principal and Vice Principal Research at the University of St Andrews. One of the things which I'm particularly interested in is that Chris originally went to study natural sciences at one of the universities which 100 years ago was regarded as one of the most British of all in Britain, Trinity College Dublin. And look what happened in the space of a few years there. And he also did a DPhil at Oxford University. He's held positions in Leeds, the Open and Bristol universities. And then he came to St Andrews as Deputy Principal and to the Wardlaw Chair in Earth Sciences in 2009. He's an isotope geochemist, and it's interesting to note that it is coming up to the centenary of the first coining of the term isotope, which, unlike many other things, has not actually been named after the person who named it, which is why we don't talk about soddies. He was a gentleman from Glasgow University. Anyway, Chris has published over 300 research papers. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the American Geophysical Union, and the Geochemical Society. And he has an honorary degree from the University of Copenhagen. So please welcome Chris Hawksworth.
Thank you, Ken. I should have had my notes about that short introduction. It's very good to be here, and let me pick up initially on one of the things that I think is important, and that is to highlight the thing about my background. Okay, I'm here, my home is in Ireland, all right? We do independence differently, but my home is in Ireland, all right? And I came to St Andrews really because of your reputation for valuing education and research. And the thing that interests me, all right, is in ensuring that there are good reasons for the best international researchers and the best students to want to be in Scotland. And many people involved in universities will take it from that point of view. And I stand here also just about as a practicing geologist who tries to get research grants. And clearly the views you get are my views. They're nothing at all to do with my institution. And what I would like to do is touch on three areas. Really, the future of universities, our relationship with UK research councils, and some of the issues about being a small country and its likely international influence. And we've heard a number of suggestions already this evening, and I'll just remind you of my Irish background. So these continue to be challenging times for universities in the UK. There are concerns that without additional funding, even the Russell Group universities will slip down world ranking leagues. Capital funding is a big, big issue. The UK higher education experienced a 600 million reduction in capital funding in 2011, but that was actually in turn clawed back from other sources. But perhaps that would be more difficult in a smaller country. And secondly, many of our competitor universities in England have sought to develop their positions by dramatically increasing their student numbers in recent years. One of the consequences of the provision of free education in Scotland is that it's very hard to do that with Scottish student places. Instead, the additional students would presumably come from the rest of the UK and elsewhere, and so this would reduce the percentage of Scottish students in Scottish universities if universities went that route in order to secure their futures. Secondly, and as we've heard, there's been much discussion about possible relationship with UK research councils. The quality of research in Scotland is high. The funds, and we get whatever figure we've been hearing, 13% of the funds awarded through the UK research grant system. And so academics in Scotland presently benefit from that proportionately high success rate and from the ease of access to government in Scotland. But there is anecdotal evidence that research grant systems in small countries elsewhere have limitations, inhibited by the size of the research community and by discussion of how much of what is inevitably a small research budget should be targeted at more applied areas and how much should be retained for blue skies research. And as many of us are currently working on the Research Excellence Framework, it's also unclear how such a key benchmarking exercise would be managed within a relatively small HEI community of an independent Scotland. So much of the discussion around funding research after independence is therefore focused on some kind of buy-in system through which researchers in Scotland could continue to submit research grants to the UK research councils much as they do at present. There's been some suggestion this could operate in ways similar to the EU in a system where all partners have similar standing. However, such a system between partners of similar status would seem to me to be different from one country buying into the research funding system of another. It is surely likely that the host country will determine the research agendas, and most unlikely that the host and guest countries will retain similar degrees of influence over research spend. And yet, in some ways, the discussion over research councils is relatively straightforward. We're familiar with how they work, and with research grant funding in Europe. Much more challenging is industry-focused research funding, as, for example, through the Technology Strategy Board. Since here, any buy-in would imply some agreement between governments over the industrial research priorities in the UK as a whole. And underlying all these discussions of how research might be funded is the presumption that both England and Scotland will want to make this work. There is a huge incentive north of the border to develop a new system, but as Andrew Marr, among others, has pointed out in his book, The Battle for Scotland, many initiatives on home rule crumbled in the face of Westminster resistance, if not indifference. The discussion of links to UK funding agencies built on the supposition that Westminster will be pleased to support independence, and that is at least not borne out by the history of these discussions. And the third point then is the question of scale, of whether internationally competitive researchers and students tend to prefer relatively large academic communities that have more influence internationally. Colleagues with close links to Scotland may well be tempted to positions in an independent Scotland, but those without such ties may prefer to seek employment in countries with a larger educational system. We may all have examples of that, but in fields that I know, all right, in geology and related fields, it is fair to say that people don't take jobs in New Zealand if they've just been offered a job in Australia. There may be many other examples that we could use. I could use Irish ones too, but that might not be opportune. But I think it is a concern. A linked aspect, then, is the performance of universities in countries with different populations in World League tables. Scotland at present does very well, with 3 universities in the top 100 of the recent QS League tables. But there is an argument that this reflects its position within the larger unit of the UK. The US, as we know, tops the league tables with 30 universities and a population of 320 million. The UK is second with 18 universities in the top 100 and a population of 65 million. But countries with populations similar to Scotland, that Scotland would have on independence, such as Ireland, Denmark, and Norway, each have only 1 university in the top 100. The implication is that with time, an independent Scotland would have 1 rather than 3 universities in the top 100. And it seems to me difficult not to conclude that fewer high-profile academics would have wanted to be here by then. So in conclusion, perhaps it's helpful to couch the argument in terms of evaluating the worst reasonable case and the best reasonable case that might follow from independence. I suspect that even the best reasonable case would be no better than today. And the concern is that the worst reasonable case will be different, and that as such, it may disadvantage researchers in an independent Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to call forward Colin McElwain now. Colin is, we've met several times before, at discussions like this, but tonight less adversarial, I think it's fair to say, because we're not taking a vote at the end of it. He's editor of Research Europe, associate editor of its sister publication Research Fortnight. He's also a columnist for Nature. He writes news and commentary and global research policy for Science and for Cell and other publications like that, although let's face it, there aren't many more publications quite as august as Nature, Science and Cell. He trained as an engineer. He has extensive experience in writing and editing on technology, business, science, research policy, including 12 years in Washington, D.C. as senior correspondent and then news editor at Nature. So let me welcome Colin McIlwain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ken, and good evening to all of you. I want to say, first of all, that I'm speaking purely in a personal capacity, not for Research Europe or Nature or anyone else. I am not a scientist, but I'm talking to you today as someone who, especially as news editor at Nature, and also as current editor of Research Europe, has written and looked carefully at how research funds are distributed in different corners of the world. And I take exception to the idea that the UK system is close to perfect and that Scotland couldn't do without it. What I want to do today is to lay out some pointers for what I hope can be a productive debate over the next year on ways of organising science and innovation in Scotland. I've got four things to say, really. One is that the innovative performance of small Northern European nations is very strong. Second, that the UK research councils have weaknesses of their own. Third, that the UK has been seriously neglecting publicly funded R&D out with the remit of the RCs for several decades now. And finally, that sound research policy needs to involve rapid and deft innovation, not self-congratulation. First point, why should we think that a small nation can't deliver a world-beating research performance? Some people have been arguing that Scotland gains from the Research Council system itself because its scientists are competing in a larger pot. I feel that the data doesn't bear that out. If we look at the Global Innovation Index, for example, compiled by the World Intellectual Property Organization, the top four innovators are Switzerland, Sweden, Singapore, Finland. Most grants from the European Research Council per head of population 2012 round, Switzerland, Netherlands, Israel and Denmark in that order. There are reams of data like that. Scotland has as strong a set of research universities as any of these countries and a richer tradition than many of them. Now, the Scottish Government hasn't published its own research plans yet post-independence, and Scotland could stick with the UK Research Councils, as has been noted. And I wanted to mention that two nations that are outside the European Union, that's Israel and Switzerland, have an arrangement like that with the European Research Council and are the European Research Council's best performers. Or it could set up its own structure. Now, scientists obviously are accustomed to the UK Research Councils, and they are high-performing research agencies. But like many UK-wide institutions, the intelligence services spring to mind, they're not as good as they keep telling everybody that they are. I sometimes think that there's an element of sort of post-imperial hubris here. UK institutions don't have to do anything. They simply assert their natural superiority. They are not subject, for example, to effective oversight through the supine committee structure at Westminster. They are not held accountable in that way. Let looking at the research councils, the Medical Research Council may be the strongest of the set, but even its autonomy has been curtailed. It's lost its headquarters, half of its staff was shipped out to Swindon. Other research councils, like the Science and Technology Funding Council and the APSRC, have had additional management problems. I have in my briefcase yesterday's edition of Research Fortnight with a story on the front page about how NERC, the Natural Environmental Research Council, has decided to open up a doctoral centre in oil and gas, but not in other industry sectors, not in other energy sectors. And as is typical within the British system, there's no way of getting to the bottom of the politics for that. It's just something that has happened. There have been similar developments along similar lines within NERC under the current coalition government. A lot of people consider the research councils to be state of art, but there are aspects of their work that are opaque and unaccountable. As one recent past official put it to me, that they're staffed by a strange mixture of gifted enthusiasts and disaffected bureaucrats. You might call me idealistic, but from my own dealings with the Scottish Government, I would argue that the Scottish Civil Service was reinvigorated by devolution, the Scottish Office. And I could see a similar event if research councils, or a research council was reformed here. The research councils also, in my view, have a somewhat old-fashioned take on innovation. They have senior business people as their chairs. That's an unusual arrangement, actually. It wouldn't happen at the DFG in Germany, National Science Foundation in the States, or in any other major power. In the case of the Medical Research Council, this is John Chisholm. Now, I don't know many people in this room, I imagine most of you know who he is, but he would not be my personal choice to be head of a Medical Research Council. Other stakeholders, for example, general practitioners, nurses, patients, tend to be locked out of the process. No programme officers are rotated from the universities to freshen things up, as happens at the US National Science Foundation. No laypersons are included on peer review panels, as happens at the US National Institutes of Health. The interaction between the research councils and the public tends to be paternalistic and one way, and so on. So they're not faultless. Now, outside of the research councils, the third thing I wanted to mention very briefly, in applied areas that are important to Scotland, such as agriculture, fishing, and especially energy, successive UK governments have slashed and burned capacity, partly in order to shore up the research council budgets. So the public, the structure of public R&D outside the research councils in things like national laboratories is now desultory in the UK. There was never much of this in Scotland anyway. The biggest part of it, the National Engineering Laboratory at East Kilbride, was closed 20 years ago, and nothing has been done to replace these places. I believe that that's a major flaw. Even David Willits believes it's a major flaw because he goes to the United States and waxes eloquently about what happens in NASA labs, what happens in Department of Energy labs, without noting that Britain has eliminated their equivalents. Finally, I want to advocate innovation in research and innovation policy. Globally, science and innovation are changing very fast. Innovation is becoming less about patents and spin-off businesses and venture capital, and more about openness and collaboration. I've been attending a series of European Union workshops on research and innovation futures, and I feel that the leaders in this area are in California and also in Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands, not in the UK, which tends to cling to the old model. Now, Silicon Valley and the linkage between Stanford University and startup companies there is now 40 years old, and we need to move on from trying to replicate its success. I feel that the example of what's happened around what used to be DC Thompson's and NCR in Dundee, but is now Rockstar, Grand Theft Auto, and the computer games industry, is perhaps a more relevant example to what future innovation will be about. And I do not believe that the British Technology Strategy Board has really got its head around that transition. Now, the relevance of Scotland to that. I mean, after a tentative start, in which it could not even speak its own name, the Scottish Government has become an important source of policy innovation within the UK context. Alcohol pricing and black and white packs for cigarettes are just the latest examples of innovative policies that Scotland would like to implement and Westminster wants to find excuses not to implement south of the border. I would challenge opponents of independence to name a single area of public policy in which the UK government has really innovated over the past 20 years. I wrote this yesterday, and then today I see that they've decided to get the Chinese to build nuclear power stations in England, which is certainly innovative, but we'll see what comes of that. I don't say, I'll skip that bit. But why, and I really want to ask, why should we believe that science and innovation, of all things, are best served by a system of government at Westminster, which is effectively a closed cabal of special interests and is incapable of innovating in itself? Whatever the referendum result, further constitutional change is coming, and research in higher education is heading down its own distinctively Scottish path, as we have heard. We should look at the options carefully and openly. We could consider what Scotland's research priorities need to be in areas like public health, poverty alleviation, energy and natural environment, fisheries, agriculture. Can UK structures adapt or modernise to address these priorities? I'm not sure that they can. Could Scotland build structures of its own that would work to promote science and innovation more effectively? I believe that there's at least a chance that it could. Thank you.
Colin, thank you. Well, 5 fascinating speakers, all of whom have honed their intellects and then brought them to bear on this question and produced wildly diverging outlooks and conclusions. So it is now time for you. Welcome to my bully pulpit. I would like you all to consider me from now on as Kirsty Walk, because I'll be pointing at you, and while somebody's talking, I'll be going, yes, you next, that sort of thing. I hope you have questions you wish to raise. I will try to not to favour any particular part of the room, which will give me a sore neck. I would like you, if possible, to raise questions, or if you just want to make a point, make a point. But speeches, possibly had enough of them tonight so far already. Time now for a bit of interaction, I think. So who would like to raise their hand first? Otherwise, I start to ask questions or just point at people randomly and put them on the spot. And my questions aren't very good, and my targeting is very poor as well. So who would like to raise something first? Oh, you're all too shy. Well, they haven't stunned you into silence, have they? Right, excellent. If as I was saying earlier on, if you push to speak, and then once you've finished, if you would push to stop speaking, and if you'd just like to introduce yourself as well.
I'll try not to make it a rant. So I'm Ian Gordon. I'm the Chief Executive of the James Hutton Institute, which is an institute that's spread between Dundee and Aberdeen, half in Dundee and half in Aberdeen. We were an NDPB, so a non-departmental public body. We're now a company limited by guarantee and a charity. And I'll just give you a little story which I think reflects some of the issues that we face here, because in effect Scotland as a government and the Scottish Office before it put a lot of investment into retaining agricultural research when the UK government didn't south of the border. And that research excellence is now in high demand because of the changes in issues that there are facing the global planet. The problem we have is that we are not eligible as an institute to apply for RC UK funding because of a rule. And the only RC UK group that we can apply to currently is done because of an agreement there is between the Scottish Government and BBSRC. And that agreement means that we can apply for competitive funding and also focused funding. However, we have been so successful that we have blown the budget, in effect. So 64% of our applications were successful in the most recent agreement. which means that we now cannot apply anymore. So you have to be very careful about what sort of agreement you put together. If an independent Scotland is going to have the universities that are going to be able to call into the RC UK. So that story says just because of our geographic location and the historical relationship that there was with the Scottish office and then the Scottish government now means that we as an institute are not able to apply for RC UK funding, despite the fact that Rick said RC UK is there to fund excellence. We demonstrate excellence and we are punished for it as an institute. And I caution Scotland, particularly Scottish universities, in relation to an engagement with the UK, RC UK, if Scotland becomes independent, that they have to be very careful about the arrangement that's set up if they're still going to apply for RC UK funding.
Let me just throw a supplemental at you, which is, that doesn't sound to me like an argument for the constitutional status quo, certainly when it comes to science funding.
I'm going to have to be very, very careful, obviously, what I say. I think we have to face the challenges that there are. My personal view is that I see that collaboration is the way forward. I think that the point made at the very end is I can see around the world that it's about collaboration and engagement, and ways in which you can get institutions to work more effectively together is the way forward in terms of the way funding is, not to isolate institutions. And I think if there's any isolation of institutions because of a decision that is made to for Scotland to become independent, I think that could cause some of the problems that we've been hearing about from some of the speakers here. So fundamentally, I think science is about innovation, and innovation has got to be about collaboration across institutions, across disciplines, and we have to find ways in which we can support that through the funding mechanisms that there are.
Thanks very much. I'll come to you. I see Stephen Salter already reaching for his button, but let me ask Professor Professor Hawksworth, Chris Hawksworth, what do you think of that observation?
I understand that, and I've had some of these discussions with them. I think the whole issue about what the relationship would be between Research Council funded research under a new constitution is all up for negotiations, and I'm just very, very wary of the asymmetry of going to do a deal with somebody else.
I should also ask Rick Rylance to defend the status quo. No, what did you hear from your perspective?
I don't particularly want to defend the status quo. I've made two observations. One is the point made at the end there about collaboration. That is the way the world is going, and the future of research funding is going to be on that basis, I think, increasingly. And research, and excellent research, will be produced between organisations and not just within singletons. The thing I'd observe about who and who can't access Research Council funding is because of protocols which surround the distribution of public money. And we can only fund accredited research organisations, as the jargon has it, which are largely universities and one or two independent research organisations, about 15 of them in the country. There is a live debate about research institutes, actually, at the moment, because they're the grey area, and I do sympathise there is a degree of ambiguity about that.
Stephen Salter?
A way to stop proper, efficient collaboration is the research assessment exercise. It used to be, in the good old days, if you wrote a letter to someone as a student or young researcher, you get very, very good help and support. Now, the people don't want to have good ideas released outside their own group. There is a forcing of collaborative groups, which then do really quite a lot to try and stop anybody else getting inside the charmed circle. And I think this is unhealthy. I would love to go back to the way it was in the 60s, when all academics liked to help one another, rather than being forced by the research assessment exercise to compete, over-compete with one another.
Lindsay Patterson, everybody wants to chip in at this, which is great. Thank you for the question.
That does seem to me to be a bit of a misrepresentation of, for example, the research pooling policy of the Scottish Funding Council and the way in which at least the ESRC and I think the other research councils from the UK level have in many cases invested in networks that have been created first in Scotland but then spread right across the Scottish universities. I'm most familiar with that in practice. You talked from experience, Stephen, in connection with the social sciences, but let me give you one example which wouldn't have happened had it not been for a collaboration between the ESRC, the Scottish Funding Council, and initially 8 universities in Scotland. It's called the Applied Quantitative Methods Network. It was to address a crisis of the steady deterioration of quantitative skills in Scottish social science. At that point, when it was founded about 6 years ago, or the discussions were taking 6 years ago, there wasn't a single node, for example, of the National Centre for Research Methods, a very high status network funded by the SRC mainly, in Scotland, and there hadn't been a successful Scottish application in the previous research methods programme, which was mainly a quantitative thing as well. To measure, there's lots of ways we can measure the success of this partnership between across universities, people not competing, and a partnership between a Scottish agency, the Scottish Funding Council, and the ESRC. Lots of measures of this. The fact that, for example, our target of 400 people was actually quadrupled. We have now 1,600 members across all, not just 8 universities, but almost every higher education institution, and the Scottish Government and the media even as well. But let me give you just one thing. There's a new thing now being developed, another partnership, Nuffield Foundation and the SRC being prominent funders of this, which is to develop a similar thing for undergraduate social scientists, which has got the completely unappealing title of the Q-Step, which must be the main indictment of the Nuffield's press office that I can imagine. But nevertheless, Q-Step funds 15 universities across the UK to develop new programs to get our undergraduate social scientists to acquire proper statistical skills. Of these 15, 3 are in Scotland. So we have a position where there were none, with the capacity to get proper quantitative research capacity, to a position where 3 universities in Scotland, with some partners in other universities, have won some of these new awards. Of course, things aren't perfect, but that does seem to me to be an example of autonomous Scottish policymaking that was initiated in Scotland, where Scottish policymakers took the initiative, but also then persuaded people outside the country, that at the moment happened to be in the UK, but it could of course be in other places, it could be international, to take decisions. The partnership is actually happening.
Lizzie, thank you. Colin wants to speak as well.
I only wanted to say I agree with all of that, but none of it collectively has substantial impact next to the overall impact of the research assessment exercises that Stephen just mentioned. I don't feel that his point was rebutted by any of that information.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to our next questioner. I said I wouldn't favour one side of the hall, but somebody over there has to stick their hand up first. So, sorry, yes.
Yeah, so Professor David Salt, working scientist, has to pay his postdocs. So it seems to me this is a question of simply a funding gap. I mean, if Scotland does become independent, then either Scotland has to come up with the extra 300 million of money so that people like me and other people can apply to the new Scottish Funding Council to get the grants, or Scotland comes up with some kind of partnering deal with the UK. And I think the danger with the partnering deal is that Scotland will have almost no say in deciding the direction of those funds, right? I mean, science has to be connected to societal need, and I think the different countries will evolve differently, and societal need will be seen differently in the different countries. So I think coming to some kind of deal with the UK funding agencies is really not going to be a good plan. So the question to me seems to be, is Scotland going to be able to find the money to support the level of science that it already has? And I don't think that question has been even remotely attempted to be answered. And I think the idea of collaboration is in no way a replacement for cash. And so I think this is a total red herring.
Well, let me ask Lindsay Patterson about that, because if there was, let's say, some kind of deal where Scotland remained within the ambit of the UK research councils, we would be asking the taxpayers in our UK, as it would no doubt be described, to continue to disproportionately fund Scottish education. They wouldn't wear that for a minute, would they?
There would have to be goodwill, and the key thing is not to have what in European Union jargon is called juste retour, which means that you get out what you put in. That's what we might call the Margaret Thatcher principle of sharing, that you get back what you put in. That's not sharing, of course, at all. I mean, one possible way of modelling such a thing would be the principle that operates in the relatively new European Research Council, where there is emphatically not a principle of juste retour. The people that get money out of the European Research Council are those who win the grants on the basis of the normal modes of academic competition. This is, if you like, also, of course, an argument in favour of competition. Competition, actually, is the best way of raising standards. In that sense, I suppose you could describe me as an academic Thatcherite, at least in an intellectual sense, but not in terms of how the money is spent. And I think that, therefore, the principle that would have to be emphatically established is that Scotland would have to, an independent Scotland would have to negotiate a contribution that it would make to some future research body covering the existing territory of the UK, but with absolutely no expectation of a proportionate return back. That what Scotland would get back would entirely depend on the capacity of Scottish academics to generate good quality proposals that would stand up against the best quality proposals from our partners in the south. Now, with goodwill, the European Research Council shows that that is actually possible. But I agree, Ken, it's not the sort of way in which international collaboration tends to happen, as the president, sadly, of Margaret Thatcher tends to show.
First time I've ever heard you describe yourself as a Thatcherite. Stephen Salter.
I think we could get 300 million by reducing the amount of research that goes into the defence industries. There's a vast amount of money in the whole of the UK that goes into finding more expensive ways of killing our people, and if Scotland didn't have to do that, we'd be able to fund perhaps a bit more medicine.
You can only cancel Trident so many times. In fact, once, I think. So there is a question that if Scotland does, what is it, broadly speaking, 9% of the UK income tax take, it gets around 13% of the UK science funding. That gap has to be filled. It would have to be filled for the Scottish Exchequer. That means once Trident is cancelled, other things would have to be. Other things would have to be.
And I'd put defence research at the top of that list.
Interesting. Yes. Stick your microphone on and tell us who you are.
Dr. Stephen Watson, University of Glasgow. I'm a mathematician. I'm a little disappointed at the lack of accuracy in the citing of figures that I've witnessed tonight. We've had 3 different figures quoted for the research take in Scotland, in the UK, and you yourself just stated that Scotland's contribution to the UK through tax is 9%, when you should know it's 9.8%.
I was speaking in journalese. And
I don't accept that. I think that it's important.
I use the word broadly.
It's important to get these it's important to get these figures right, because if our tax input is 9.8% and we get back 9.3%, then already that 0.5% makes up a substantial amount of money, which could be. So when you make jokes in parallel about how many times you can cancel Trident, I feel that you're doing a disservice to the debate.
But you can only cancel Trident once.
My point is that you were looking for cash, but in your own quoting of tax take, you casually forgot that we get back less than we put in. So there are a number of ways. I think that the question of the fiscal position of Scotland, we could have a debate over, but I think that that's for another context. I mean, there already has been, I believe, a debate on the fiscal position of an independent Scotland. And I would like to focus more on actually the vision for the future of Scottish science rather than a numbers game.
Now, that's interesting, because up till now, I mean, I don't know what you all think of the constitutional debate so far, but some of it's been pretty cold kale. And it seems to be at the moment Tesco politics. This will cost you this much, this will cost you that much. And a trap into which I perhaps fell there, and I'll agree with that. What about the vision? What is the vision?
So I'll make a comment. So one thing that's not been remarked on, which I think is useful to point out, is that the research councils in the UK are moving in some directions which are quite unusual relative to past practice. So, for example, the Doctoral Training Centre initiative, which has started to be unfolded across the UK, and it's not really been remarked the impact this will have on PhD research and its spread across the UK. Now, I would say that this is in fact one place where Scotland could easily step out in a new direction and envision graduate education more modelled on the US system, a well-costed system actually.
What about the point that was made earlier on about, I'm sorry, because I'm just interested, but the point made about Australia and New Zealand, that because New Zealand's smaller, that somehow it is less attractive to take a job in New Zealand, academic job in New Zealand, than it is to take one in Australia. Did that appeal to you at all, or do you think that...
So actually what sprang to mind was actually a point that was made by Colin about the need for nimble and agile institutions in the modern era. And I would actually back that up with referring to a very prominent physicist, Neil Turok, who currently heads up the Perimeter Institute in Canada. And his interpretation of what countries need to do to be successful in the 21st century is actually focused on the small is beautiful because of its nimbleness and the speed to which it can adjust to needs. So I don't quite buy in the 21st century the notion of the need for size, so to speak. It's agility that matters.
Yeah, say hello.
Hello, Richard Marsh. Just a quick one on these figures. We take 9.8% of the spend of the tax income, that's quite true, is paid to Westminster, but we get 9.3 back of the total spend. And the total spend is very much larger, so in fact, there's a net gain to us. The 9.3 figures are a much bigger sum of money than the 9.8%, because it's 9.3% of the total spend. So actually, we benefit enormously.
So again, I think
these figures are used by the Nats, but they're quite wrong.
No, I think that's also perhaps not quite an accurate representation, because those figures are the tax take, which do not take account of, in fact, Scotland would then hold essentially 100% of the oil revenue tax base, which is not in those figures. So indeed, when you start to really look at the numbers from the standpoint of an independent Scotland, you would see that that alone, as you've said, isn't a fair representation either. So,
thanks to both of you for that, and I think that illustrates something. I hate to use something as unscientific, as unscientific a term as focus group, but anytime the BBC focus groups or polls people about what they want to know about the constitutional debate, what they say is, we don't want to hear more men in suits shouting at each other. I don't mean you two, largely because, oh yeah, well, they are wearing suits actually. But they want good, solid, hard facts. And the trouble is, the facts don't seem to be good, solid, or hard. Lindsay Patterson, why is there still such a divergence in the numbers which are being bandied about?
Because there's so many different ways of defining it and interpreting it. The examples I gave, the data I gave, and I can give you the sources, which apparently are now in any case on the papers on the Royal Society of Edinburgh website, so they can be freely downloaded. They relate to Research Council expenditure, subdivided by the Research Councils and then fitting that with academic fields from the Higher Education Information Database for Institutions. So that's the source. But of course you could define it in different ways. For example, I guess that the higher percentages that have sometimes been quoted for the Scottish income for medical research will refer to also to research spending by the NHS itself, and may also be to commercial pharmaceutical research. I don't know, but that would be why you would get different definitions. The point is, of course, that these things can all be legitimately disputed, and there is never going to be a settled position on the statistics. There cannot be a resolution of that. Those people who want the debate to settle down, having been totally reliably informed by some statistician, are really wishing for utopia. It will continue to be an ideological argument.
And also concerned with the vision as well, and I think we will hear more and more of vision, particularly when the Scottish Government's white paper comes out. That's going to be very interesting and may possibly energise the debate. Rick?
I completely agree with Lindsay about the figures. It depends what you count. What I wanted to do is make an observation about postgraduates. This is a personal statement. This is not an RC UK one. I think there is a debate to be had, not just in Scotland, but across the UK about how we organise postgraduate education, what constitutes a PhD degree, and so on. There are umpteen different ways of doing it across the planet, and why do we think this current one is the best one? But one of the intriguing facts to me about the current situation UK-wide in postgraduate is we're at a historic high in terms of the number of postgraduate students we have, and 46% of them come from overseas. Now, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's something which is a constitutive factor of the way we organise postgraduate work.
Chris Hawksworthy, I wanted to ask you something as well. I know you've got a point to make, please feel free to make it, but I just wondered how the situation in Ireland is set up at the moment. How's research funded in the Irish Republic?
Let me get to understand, but can I come back? I mean, the New Zealand-Australia story is simply something to be wary of, all right? I mean, I think it is a fair description, all right? I think if you're setting up a new country that's independent, there are ways to address it. And one is to have more money, and we're back to cash, all right? But the other is to be very wary of systems whereby the community is so small that reviewing research grants and passing them around becomes sort of Buggin's turn, and it's hard to get out of that. So that there's simply things that if you look around the world, lots of other examples, just to be wary of if you have a small community. Ireland has been through all the financial crises. Ireland became very, very, very focused on the government selecting 2 or 3 things they were going to put their money into, all right? And they, unlike Paul Nurse the other day, they basically said government could pick winners in certain specific areas, and if you weren't in those areas, actually you weren't going to get very much money. Now, since then, the amount of research money has increased and it's getting better. But it's, to me, as a pure research scientist, it suffered hugely from over-targeting the areas that government would put research money into.
Thank you. Now, let's see, I spotted you first, so it's only fair. I see you there.
Geordie Burdett Stewart. Innovation, that much abused word. In a recent global survey, the US came first, Japan came second, France came third. Populations 330, 110, 70 million. If, has been suggested, an independent Scotland would lose, and this was directly related, it was said, to the amount of institutes of higher learning and scientific achievement, also including the wonderful James Hutton, of course. If Scotland was to become independent, it would be losing, we are told, institutes that fit into this bracket. It's quite clear that we would disappear completely in the innovation stakes.
Disappear completely, Colin McElroy?
I have no idea what that survey is or where the figures come from, but I quoted some myself that were from the World Intellectual Property Organisation. And the small nations do extremely well on these international innovation comparisons. The New Zealand-Australia thing does seem to me, I'm afraid, to be somewhat of a selective example. I mean, Singapore and Switzerland, for example, are prime locations for postgraduate students globally without any problem of this small scale. They've dealt with small scale in different ways. You don't disappear, and Scotland would not disappear from the international map.
Okay.
Briefly, I mean, that is absolutely to your aspiration as Scots, all right, and what you want to make of your country. And as an aspiration, that's fantastic, all right. But Switzerland does it by putting huge amounts of money in, all right. Just been to the ETH, the amounts of money are fantastic, £3 million for every appointment, okay, and to fund their labs. So put that money in, okay, and obviously people will flock to Scotland. Do you think it's likely? That's not my call.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Pete Downs, University of Dundee and convener of University of Scotland. Just a few points as a debate has carried on. First of all, I mean, it's very clear. You can argue this thing from both sides. Small is beautiful. We need to be agile. Critical mass is essential for us to be competitive. So how do you judge those different things? So in a sense, that's not what the argument is about. I think we heard that people would choose to work in New Zealand over Australia. Well, that's because Australia's got better universities than New Zealand, and they'd sure as hell prefer to go to maybe Singapore or Switzerland. So scale isn't everything, and I think we need to see, the debate needs to see beyond those issues. I am quite concerned that we take some very positive things and turn them into negative arguments. So we heard how difficult it would be for Scotland because it's so successful at capturing, well, we might argue about the numbers, but it's successful at capturing grant income from the UK research councils. That isn't a problem for Scotland, that's Scotland's success and the success of Scottish institutions. And provided that Scotland's universities are properly funded, whatever the constitutional outcome, will continue to compete for whatever funds we're eligible to apply for, whether that's because we've negotiated an arrangement to retain access to UK-wide funding, or whether because we're searching in other markets like the European Community or through wider international partnerships. So these are all things that I think we can handle. The critical question for me is why can't we argue about the positive attributes of the UK, rather than to see the argument in terms of Scotland will be bereft, Scotland will be in trouble if it's not part of this system? I don't believe the evidence really strongly supports that. But there surely must be an argument to say the UK has some value in and of itself. And the connectivity between the components of the UK should be something we also can value and talk about positively. And in that context, Scotland should be seen as a valuable player in a UK-wide system, and something that the other nations of the UK might think about not wanting to lose.
Positive arguments for the UK have not been prominent in the debate. So I don't mean this debate, but in the debate so far. Perhaps because we're still in the phoning war before things actually start to hot up. Gentleman in the front row, pretending I don't know him.
Thank you, Ken. Lewis MacDonald, MSP, and I've had the good fortune to be in this space as a student and as a teacher, and indeed as a government minister in the devolved government 12 years ago when the Scottish Parliament met here. And I guess there's a couple of things strike me about the debate so far. I think a couple of comments have been made about the invigorating effect of devolution, about the strength that has come from devolution, and I would completely endorse that. Comments have also been made critical of UK government policies or UK government priorities, much of which I sympathised with as well. But I think the question about what is the positive benefit of the UK, I think Rick Rylance at the outset set some of that out, that actually the UK is pretty good in global terms, in terms of research, and the scale of what is sustained here is pretty significant. And I guess, having been involved in devolved government and in a devolved parliament since the beginning, what I'm very conscious of is that invigoration of Scotland, and that Scotland walking more proudly on the world stage, is something that has been achieved in the context of devolution and in the context of being part of a bigger player. When I had ministerial responsibility for Scottish higher and further education, it was one of the things that struck me internationally, was that it was possible to promote Scotland for its merits and for its distinctiveness, and at the same time people like the Chinese and others who were interested in what we were doing were interested partly because we were a backdoor into the UK and into the European Union. And actually, I think where we are now is the best of both worlds. We need to develop it and take it forward in a positive way, as has been described. But to walk away from that and go down a completely different route of a separate country, I think would be a mistake for many of the reasons we've heard this evening.
Is it a completely different route, given what Donald Dewar said about devolution being a process, not an event? I completely agreed with Donald Dewar when he said and it is a process, and it's a process that's continued. We've had a different party in government for the last 6 years. They have obviously added to that process. We've had different policy areas that have been involved in the last 12 years, and that's positive as well. But devolution is explicitly a division of powers between different governments in the same space. And what is proposed, and I supported devolution because I thought the United Kingdom was a centralised and centralist state to the detriment of all its component parts. I think to walk away from a devolved United Kingdom and have a centralised Scotland would be to reverse the process. And if devolution is a process, it would be going not just in the wrong direction, it would actually be going backwards, to walk away from devolution and to have all power concentrated in a single set of hands. I have a hand over here. I see you as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Muir Russell, I used to run another university and do a little bit of devolution as well in my spare time. I wanted to sort of shift this back a wee bit and up a wee bit. We've heard a bit about the REF, the new research assessment process. It's about outcomes and it's about evidence. And I thought we got quite a bit of evidence. I mean, we know that we're good at higher education in Scotland. We know that we have more of it than per head or whatever than other countries. It's one of our big businesses, and we're good at it. And whether we argue about 9.8% or 10.2%, whatever's not the point. And I think it's very important that we should try to focus this debate on what are the things that have made us good, And what will keep us good, and we've heard a lot about reputation, about credibility, about being international with the academics, with the collaborations, with where the students come from, with how the work is then applied in our relations with multinationals and so on. And the fact of the matter is that we've got a system that, on the basis of what we were told, has been doing a fairly reasonable job in delivering that. And I'm always reminded of the comment, they asked a man, how's your wife? And he said, compared with what? And it's very important that the what should be something that we fully understand. If we go down some of the other directions that are being talked about, we need to know what we'd gain. And we might gain some things, I haven't heard them tonight, but we might. And we might lose some things. We could probably sort out the funding. I mean, there's always deals to be done. But what about the process? I mean, the credibility of the process that has given us where we've got, I think it's very important that we should understand as an academic audience what we really value in that and whether it is delivering the things that Rick and Lindsay were saying or not. I rather think that it is, and I think that a wider academic audience here would probably be wanting to ask these questions quite pointedly that I'm asking. And if anyone hasn't seen it, the Muffy-Calder paper that came out a few days ago, encapsulating what are the questions from the community, now it's only science and engineering, do focus very sharply on people's concerns about the single research area, the credibility of the assessment processes, being credible with funders, with international charities and all the rest of it. There's a whole raft of things that the case has to be made for, and a little bit of wishful thinking, if I could call it that, about what we might be able to do just on our own, has got to be tempered by asking, could we really run a Scottish Research Council that would cover all the things? Is it credible that academics would have any other time in their diary but reading other people's papers? And I'll finish with a self-serving anecdote. Just when we were running into devolution, I remember talking at the Royal Society about whether we could have something which was essentially what the council has become, the Science Advisory Council. And a hand went up at the back, and it was in the gloom, and I couldn't see it was. And somebody said, we need a Scottish Research Council because those expletives in Swindon just turned down my grant. And that's not the basis on which we would change all the stuff that works, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I continue to see you, Sir Sukhu, but I think it is important. I present a radio programme which goes out on Sunday mornings before most of you are up, probably. And we look at the Sunday papers, and sometimes I get complaints because there aren't enough women on it, and there aren't enough women taking part in the debate in the 52% of the Scottish population. Well, Madam, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Elizabeth Russell, retired academic. Can I just support what Muir Russell's been saying and move it perhaps forward a bit? One of the previous RSE meetings concluded, amongst other things, that what Scotland needed for the future did not in any way did not totally depend on whether we were independent or not. And that perhaps what the debate should be doing now is moving to say more analytically, what does Scotland need either way for it to be bigger and better in its impact, both in terms of industry and in terms of education and research. And can I ask any of the members of the panel, the analysis that they've done so far and the opinions they've put in them tonight, can they take that to the stage of saying which of those are crucial for Scotland to continue to be as good as it is now? And where would we best get them?
Do we have a volunteer? Do we have more than one volunteer? Probably not fair to ask you, Rick, because, well, it's up to you. Please feel free to press the button.
I'm not quite clear about the question, sorry. The question is, as it were, if I could do something, what would I do to enhance the...
The question is to analyse, and you may not be the right person, the question is to analyse what are the good things that Scotland has, what does Scotland need to get better in research and academic terms, and is that more easily found under the current system than not, but to be clear about what are the critical factors that will make it work or not.
It seems to me the positives are glaringly obvious. You know, you've got a number of outstandingly high-achieving institutions. You've got a research tradition which is long-rooted and extremely productive. You've got some imagination around sharing facilities and developing collaborative work and so on. All of those things, it seems to me, under whether Scotland goes independent or doesn't, must persist, you know. And if you sacrifice those things, you're stuffed, you know. It's pretty blunt. And the sorts of things I think are really crucial, like thinking about comparative advantage on a limited area. You know, what are you really, really good at? Some degree of focus around specialist expertise and some degree of local control. You know, all of those things would be things that may result from independence. But they are things that everywhere needs those things. You know, it's true of the bit of England I live in, the southwest, as it's true of the northwest.
Thank you. So you.
And I worked with Elizabeth Russell, who is a very distinguished public health doctor. And my view would be that what we should be looking at, among other things that we haven't really discussed tonight, is what changes will happen if we get a no vote, and we need more devolution. That seems to be generally agreed. I would say that sometimes you have to look at more centralisation across the UK. In my field, in microbiology, I bitterly regret that we never had a UK public health lab service like CDC Atlanta, which has been very, very successful in doing research. It's a national organisation in the United States. It has all sorts of difficulties with states because they want to do their own thing, but the CDC is so good intellectually, it carries the day, and it discovers things like HIV and all the rest of it. And the PHLS in England, it's been trashed and modified, and we have a sort of replica in Scotland. I think we would be better in Scotland if we went back to a system we never had the system properly because it was Second World War innovation. If we had a UK system, because the Scottish talents and the talents from the rest of the UK coming together in one central organisation, it wouldn't necessarily have to be based in any particular place. You can have almost a virtual organisation, would I think bring big public health benefits in terms of all those nasty bugs that are just around the corner. And my counter-example is what happened in Germany with that new E. coli strain. They had a federal system there, and it was a disaster because people they destroyed the Spanish cucumber industry because one of the federal bits said the wrong thing at the wrong time. They didn't have that central organisation which the Germans traditionally had and lost in the 1930s. So I would hope that when we go forward to have more links with England. We don't split off. We have more links with England, and in some areas we have centralisation. I'm sorry to disagree with Lewis, but I think in special areas there's a good case for that.
Colin, Michael Wayne's light is already on.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to say that these are the things like the CDC are just an example of what I was talking about how the UK has basically concentrated all of its research resources into the research councils and into academic research, which is valuable in itself. And of course the citation data and the strengths of the UK universities partly reflect that decision. But the rest of public funded R&D, which in most countries is considerably larger than public support for academic R&D, has really been decimated in Britain over the past 20 years in order to try and maintain the science vote, the budget for what the research councils do. I feel that the kind of steps that Hugh mentions are really badly needed, and they will not happen at a UK level.
Lindsay Patterson.
There is I'm an academic, and so I'm not advocating either independence or opposition to independence. It seems to me that what's incumbent on academics is to take the two possible scenarios and work out what would have to be done to avoid the worst possible effects of each of them and to take advantage of the best possible effects of each of them. So let me say then, since I think most of what I've said so far would probably be interpreted as being sceptical about independence, that it does seem to me that Scottish academics have a tradition since the 1970s in this debate about Scottish autonomy of being remarkably lacking in self-confidence. There have been claims here, for example, that a Scottish Research Council would simply be a matter of Buggan's turn. There's a claim here that we would be unable to adequately referee each other's papers because we would spend our entire week refereeing each other's papers because we're a small country. There's a claim here that we would forget 300 years of distinguished intellectual tradition. All of that is not really very credible. We will continue to be part of networks with our colleagues down south. Some of us will be our colleagues down south because we will move there, or our students will move there, and then they'll come back, and then they'll go away again, and then they might go to New Zealand or indeed Ireland. And that's the way that the international market in academics operates. And exactly the same happens in the international market of ideas. It's already the case that the UK research councils often have to go for the referees almost entirely or entirely outside the UK. For example, when the biggest household panel study in the world, the UK Household Longitudinal Study, now called Understanding Society, was set up because there was only really one credible bid from the UK. Every single referee, all members of the evaluating panel, in other words, were from outside the UK. Absolutely right and proper. That didn't cause a problem for these distinguished social scientists elsewhere in the world. They were delighted to contribute to what they saw as a world leader because they respected the academic distinction of the people who were putting forward the proposals, and it should be said also they respected the integrity and the distinction of the SRC at that time, the grant awarding body. Now that shows that it is possible to continue to operate in international networks. It's possible to avoid parochialism if you have the self-confidence and if you go out and negotiate. It does require goodwill on the other side, but actually, to be quite honest, it requires not really so much the goodwill of the other government, although that could be useful in terms of funding. Above all, it requires the goodwill of academics elsewhere, because a lot of this happens entirely independently of government. It's got nothing to do with governments. In fact, to be honest, and here's me being Thatcherite for a second time, I suppose, Ken, get governments off our back and just let academics get on with it and do the good things for themselves. So academics, stop talking Scottish academia down, as you did in the 1970s, when I was a student here like Lewis, when I remember at my graduation ceremony cringing in embarrassment when the vice principal of this year's place at a graduation ceremony denounced Scottish devolution. Stop doing that now. Talk about the different scenarios and the solutions that you could offer to independence, even if you don't like independence, but also to a continuation of the Union, if you like the continuation of the Union. How can we get the benefits of small country innovation while still being part of a large UK settlement? That seems to me to be what academics should be doing.
Chris Hawksworth.
And I'm not going to disagree, but I have a slight technical question really to the social scientists. My understanding about scale and strategy and focus, in a way, is that as units, as countries, as certainly Ireland did, was smaller, right, they had to focus resource more, all right? And as you go to bigger units, there's more sense of breadth and less focus you can get away with, and Paul Nurse can make his case. And so I think there may be a technical question out there, that social science will answer better than I can, that actually if you shrink the size of your country, from the UK to Scotland, whether that drives your funding structure to be more focused, and whether that's something you would like. And secondly, the aspect is, if you're buying into another country's funding structure, have you any chance to influence it? Because if you haven't, then it seems to me that's a very strong statement.
Okay. Now, yes, I'm delighted to welcome our second female contributor. That's probably my fault, sorry.
I'm Mary Johnston from Health Psychology in Aberdeen, and I just want to raise what I think is a criterion for judging research that hasn't really been raised very much so far. Yes, I agree, innovation is important. But a lot of the criteria that we're using are how much money can we get and how much glory can we get. I think it's another kind of thing, not just what can your country do for you, but what can you do for your country. I think we should be judging research to some extent by what extent it can be applied and useful to the country. And I have worked a lot in England and a lot in Scotland, and I've seen much more sense of being able to contribute to how things are applied in Scotland. And I've also seen it in Ireland, and that may be the issue of the focused research, but in my area, it's certainly true that the people in Ireland are contributing more to the issues of their country. And I certainly think that when we think about things like social deprivation, the research on social deprivation is influencing policy in Scotland in terms of the way we deliver our health services and things like that. So I would like to hear a little bit more about how we value research in terms of what research can do for the country, especially when the Royal Society of Edinburgh thinks it values useful knowledge.
Anybody like to pick up on that? It's a cri de coeur, I think, as much as anything else, isn't it? But it's also, I mean, given that research in science is international, and as we've heard, has, even in Scotland, has an international, well, it's not a focus, it is an international reach. Is localism on that level parochialism?
I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing the international research, and I certainly think we should be bringing the international excellence to answering the questions that our country needs answered. But I think a country fails if it doesn't use its research to generate all the values that the society has, like health, wealth, and education.
Thank you. Time for one more thought, and I'm very sorry about this. Obviously, many more ideas than I've managed to manage the time for.
Okay, thank you very much. Phil Hannaford, Professor of Primary Care here and Vice Principal for Research. We have an example of the problems that might come up with the Research Council funding in the future. And the example is NHS funding for research. It's not true that that's been cut back in the UK. That's actually had very stable funding recently and is worth about £1 billion into the economy. And Scotland does very well in that. But we have been, we've got an ambivalent attitude between Scotland and England. We pay into some of the English schemes, which means that or some of the UK schemes, sorry, which means that we can access that resource. And other schemes we don't pay into, we can't access those resources. So initially we were able to fund fellowships for new academics, growing academics. We can't access that money now and we lose out. We do have a replacement fund called the Chief Scientist's Office. They fund some research. Their budget is about £35 million of money for grants. Compare that to 800 million pounds in the UK. We can access, as a Scottish researcher, a grant from CSO. That's the maximum of £350,000. You can't do a clinical trial on that, which is my area of research. If I want to do a properly funded, properly sized trial, it costs £1.2 million. I have to go to the NIHR to get that, which is the UK funding body. I don't think we'll have access to that if Scotland were independent, because I think England would say, you're independent now, you've got the oil, you sort it out, we're not allowing you to access our funds. And Scotland would lose out. We do extremely well with NHS funded research, as well as Research Council funded research as a country, and we wouldn't be able to access that resource.
One final point, because I'm afraid we are down into the area of making points rather than asking questions. Sir?
Yeah. Can I just say, everybody in the room right now has been talking about research, and it does say higher education, and part of higher education is students like me and him, right? Like, one of the other things you have to bear in mind is the £300 million gap, which was being talked about earlier, doesn't seem like a huge amount of money to the UK, because the UK is quite a large country. But to a smaller country like Scotland, would a £300 million gap be able to be paid in any other way than actually introducing the fees, which Sam has said, what was it, the rocks will melt from the sun? Yes.
Thank you. Colin McElwain, do you want to pick up on that?
I suppose the only thing what I want to really say about that is that the British decision, the coalition government decision to move funding for undergraduate education off the public sector borrowing requirement, while the government continues to fund it, and piles up a huge amount of debt on a particular generation that will not have the opportunities and the careers that my generation had. That decision, or that change, was an act of sophistry rather than an act of responsible policy. There's no possibility of the debt even being paid off, and the public continues to fund the education as it did before, except through loans. This business about funding, the 300 million, this alleged £300 million gap. The universities in Scotland have been talking about a funding gap on the HE side, on the other side, for many years now, but the gap has not materialised because the Scottish Government has been able to find the resources to fund the universities, and because universities and higher education are a huge priority here in Scotland. If there was independence, the money would be found to fund research, council type research through whichever scheme was elected. There's no question that the political will would exist for that to happen. So the funding gap, I'm afraid, as far as I'm concerned, is a complete red herring.
The 300 million can be estimated in two ways. First of all, as a total of the RC UK spending in 2012-13, which gives you £307 million, or alternatively, there is a separate estimate from the Scottish Government's Chief Scientific Advisor that as a percentage of GDP, Scotland spends 0.95%, whereas the average is a 0.7. That amounts to, if you do the calculations based on a Scottish GDP of 130 billion, comes to 325 million. I rounded them down to be generous to the nationalists.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm afraid our seminar is drawing to an end, although the debate, as I'm sure you've noticed, is just beginning. I hope this has enlightened you in well, more than one way. I think that, as I was saying earlier on, that sometimes the debate so far has seemed a bit cold kale. I've heard arguments that, of course, Scotland could afford a defence budget without actually specifying against whom we'll be defending ourselves, although we only have one nation with a land border. I've also heard the Better Together campaign, or as we prefer to call them, the No campaign, saying that if you vote yes, you'll get slower broadband. I think the arguments here are an awful lot better than that, and have been. I would just ask you, well, just to point out, not to follow what was observed by that great political philosopher Paul Simon, that a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. And bear in mind that whatever the vote turns out to be next September, we will remain neighbours on the same island. On that note, I'd like to welcome a man to whose laptop I would love to get access, because he actually has written a report for the Scottish Government on the possible ways of funding higher education and research after independence, and it would be a great story to get my hands on, but I don't think I'm going to get it. I'd like to ask up to the podium now Professor Ian Diamond, the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of our hosts, the University of Aberdeen.
Again, thank you very much, colleagues. You'll be pleased to know that when I was asked to say a few words at the end, they said, will you speak for 5 minutes, but preferably no more than one? So I'm not quite sure how to take that statistically as a statistician, but what I would just like to say is to thank you all for coming. This university has been around for over 520 years. It has a long history of being a safe place for difficult debates and for difficult discussions, and a long history of enabling debate to take place. I think that's what we've seen tonight. So I feel very privileged as Principal of the University of Aberdeen that we have been able to host what I think has been a very good debate on what is a truly important topic. And no, you cannot see my laptop. No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.